Namaste. We're very glad and grateful that you could join us today, and welcome to today's talk, What is Sanskrit and Why Should I Care? Our esteemed lecturer today is Dr. Antonia Ruppel. Dr. Ruppel, or Antonia as she is respectfully addressed by her students, first heard the word Sanskrit at the age of 19. Someone had handed her a Sanskrit book while she was studying classics at the University of Cambridge in the UK. That one fortunate accident, or fate as some might call it, sent her down the path that brings us all together today. Dr. Ruppel ended up learning Sanskrit as an autodidact. That means someone who is self-taught. If you've ever tried to learn Sanskrit, you will know what an incredible feat of brilliance and perseverance that is. Lucky for all of us, she has dedicated much of her adult life to using her Sanskrit superpowers to help the rest of us learn the language. As the author of her own successful textbook, The Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, Antonia has taught over 1,000 students all over the world across the last 15 years. Cornell, Oxford, the LMU Munich, and online at Yogic Studies. A group of children in the UK were even lucky enough to have Antonia as their Sanskrit instructor at St. James Senior Boys School. That's right. So students age 11 to 18 in the UK were and are studying Sanskrit in school. My name is Shana Parekh, and I live in Bangalore, India. You can probably tell that from my accent. I'm here by way of California. I have been Antonia's student for the past few months online. While my red ink-filled homework notebook may cause you to wonder otherwise, I have absolutely loved the experience. Antonia is one of the most passionate, patient, dedicated, and detail-oriented teachers that I have ever met across any subject. And you will get a taste of that in this lecture today. The way that she describes the creative beauty of the language, her charming explanation of the dozens of ways an elephant can be described in Sanskrit, her clear and easy to understand explanation of everybody's favorite topic, Sandhi. These are just a few of the reasons why I consider her one of the world's best Sanskrit teachers. For those of you who would love to experience Sanskrit as taught by Antonia, we will be providing you with course and contact information at the end of this lecture. And now, before Sanskrit comes up with another 100 ways to describe an elephant, it is my honor to welcome Dr. Antonia Ruppel.
Thank you so much, Shana, for this marvelous introduction. If I wasn't wearing makeup, you would be seeing that I'm blushing furiously right now. Hello, everyone. I am so glad that you're here. I will begin by saying to you the exact same thing that I also say to my online students. Get comfortable, get something to drink, get a snack, maybe get your knitting, get your pets. I know that some people enjoy watching online talks while doing the dishes, doing yard work or something like that. Whatever works for you is great for me. Anything that lets you just keep your mind free for about an hour, which is how long I'm going to talk to you today about Sanskrit. So let me share my screen, which as always takes a few seconds. There we go. So I would like to talk today about two questions. First of all, what is Sanskrit? And then I'll also talk a little bit about why on earth should any of us care about it. I want to start by way of introduction by looking at perspectives on the Sanskrit language. Then I'll talk about the history of the language itself, continue on to what I'm here calling Sanskrit proper, which could also be called just Sanskrit or classical Sanskrit. And then I'll say a little bit about uses of Sanskrit today. Starting with perspectives. Now, in public discourse these days, you often find two kinds of perspectives contrasted with one another: the Eastern versus the Western, or the Indian versus the European or the Anglo-centric. And those are often equated with an inside and an outside perspective. And some people then argue that the only people who can truly understand Sanskrit and therefore talk about it, tell others about it, is if they have this inside perspective. So basically, if they are South Asian, either living in India or in a South Asian family somewhere else in the world. I would like to respectfully disagree with that, for the simple reason that while it's absolutely true that I did not grow up in a culture where many traces, many remnants, many elements of ancient Sanskrit culture are still very much present. So I did not grow up surrounded by monuments to deities mentioned in Vedic or Sanskrit texts. I did not grow up attending weddings or funerals where many of the, or at least part of the rite goes all the way back to Vedic hymns. I think that, so while I'm lacking that, I think that while Sanskrit texts, the original Sanskrit cultures, are still very much relevant today, they have their roots in the past. And when it comes to the past, especially the long ago past, I would argue that actually all of us are outsiders. All of us are foreigners to that. And the thing to do to become an insider, to become at home in those long ago cultures, is through systematic, careful, patient, dedicated study of the monuments of those times. Those monuments can be physical. So for example, archaeological things like buildings, temples, remnants of houses, pottery, and so on. Or they can be intellectual monuments, which means texts. And if you want to study those texts, what you need to do is to learn the language or languages of those texts, and then study those texts in as much detail and with as much patience and with as much with as neutral a perspective as possible. And that is something that everyone can do, because those sources that are available for that sort of study, I would argue that they're available everywhere. If I compare it to my own background, so I grew up in Germany, went to school in Germany, but still when it comes to something like Germany 500 years ago, or the same area 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, if I wanted to know anything about it, I couldn't ask my parents or my grandparents, so what was it like back then? I have no lived experience of it. The only way that I can learn about those periods is through written sources, through archaeological sources, and those would be available not just to someone who happens to have a German passport or grew up in Germany, but basically to everyone. And that is the reason why I think, and I hope, I have a few things to say about Sanskrit that are not only not wrong, but also maybe interesting and helpful for all those of you listening today. The other two perspectives that are sometimes contrasted are the academic and the spiritual. And basically what you're getting from me today is entirely the academic perspective, which I would define as the basis, the fundament of what we have. So the evidence that is given to us through the language, which gets us access to the many texts that we have in Sanskrit. And that is what I'm going to limit myself to. There are also many spiritual perspectives, and the various spiritual traditions based on Sanskrit texts basically take certain elements of this very broad tradition and focus on those elements and then work in more detail on those elements. And as I say, will stay with the basis today. And I hope that even if your main interest in Sanskrit is spiritual, you will still find my talk not entirely boring, because what I'm going to talk about, as I say, is kind of the basis of all that we have for Sanskrit. So much on perspectives. Now, history of the language. I'll actually start at the very beginning, the prehistory of the language, the Indo-European roots of Sanskrit. I'll go on to the earliest period of the Sanskrit language, which we usually call Vedic. Then I'm going to focus on one man, Panini, and I'll tell you more about why on earth I make that change from this whole period to one man when we get to it. And then the last thing I will talk about in the as concerns the history is classical Sanskrit, Sanskrit proper, or simply Sanskrit. Now, when I say Sanskrit has Indo-European roots, I use this term Indo-European, which describes a language family that spreads from India in the east to Europe in the west. And when this term was coined, it was meant entirely as a geographical delineation, simply to describe languages that were spoken in an area that spanned from India in the east to Europe in the west. This would be pre-modern colonialism, which spread those languages even further. And when I say that Indo-European languages are a language family, what I mean is that they're a group of languages that are related to one another through a common ancestor. So they're genetically related. And this common ancestor is called Proto-Indo-European. And they developed separately when speakers moved apart. Now, this is a phenomenon that all of you may already have noticed, unless you're very young, that language changes, spoken language changes. This is something that happens to all languages. It's a completely natural phenomenon that, you know, young people talk differently from yourself or your grandparents maybe. And normally what happens when you have a language community, speakers who speak the same language that are all in contact with one another, the changes that occur in that language, usually after a while, are taken up by all or almost all the speakers of that language. However, when speech communities move apart, so for example, when there's migration, then a group that starts out speaking unified language after it's split up, basically has different sets of developments, different sets of language innovations that at some point mean that these two different groups that are not in contact with one another anymore speak what we would call entirely different languages. So they start out speaking the same language. At some point they speak things that are slightly different. And then in the end, they speak two forms of speech that are not mutually intelligible anymore. And doesn't want me to continue. There we go. And so I'm here giving you this very common sort of tree model of how these languages split up. I chose this particular graphic simply because it's so nice and aesthetically pleasing. We here have Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European at the root, and then we have a movement eastward, we have a movement westward, and then those branches split up further, and in the crowns of that tree, we then have all the languages derived from Proto-Indo-European that are still spoken today. People noticed that Sanskrit was related to European languages pretty much as soon as there was contact between the two continents. So the Europeans coming to India noticed this probably as early as the 16th century, and the earliest Western grammar of Sanskrit that we've got is from the 1660s. So the 17th century, but systematic language comparison only began in around the 19th century on, and that then resulted in overwhelming evidence that these languages are related as siblings or as cousins, so sort of on a par, on the same level, through a common ancestor, and not, as some had originally speculated, by means of direct descendants. So as far as we can tell, and we're pretty certain about this, it's not the case that Greek or Latin derive from Sanskrit, but rather Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and all these other languages derive from a common ancestor. Now, I can tell you lots more about why we think that. However, this is not a talk about Indo-European, this is a talk about Sanskrit. So if you'd like to know any more about that, simply ask me about it in the Q&A afterwards. That takes us to the oldest stage of our language, which we call Vedic. Vedic is the language of the Vedas and the texts commenting on them. Now, Veda is a Sanskrit word that means knowledge. And the Vedas are certain texts that contain the knowledge needed for carrying out the religious rites, ceremonies, rituals of the time. And we think that the Vedic period lasted from around 3,500 to around 2,500 years ago. The oldest text is the so-called Rig Veda, which literally means verse knowledge. This is a collection of just over 1,000 hymns, hence verse, so hymns written in verse. And this collection of hymns is around 3,500 to around 3,000 years old. Now, the oldest surviving manuscripts actually date to the 14th century AD, so much, much, much later. But we are pretty certain that the oldest surviving physical evidence is not from the same time as when these texts first came to be. For a variety of reasons. First of all, if you take a look, so this is what many manuscripts that we have look like. They're written either on paper or on birch bark or on palm leaves. So all on very perishable materials that can easily basically be destroyed or rot away, especially in a climate such as what we have in at least most parts of India. And so that's one reason why we're pretty certain that, the Rig Veda is older than the material evidence that we've got for it. The other evidence, which is by far the more important, is that we know that the Rig Veda came to be through what we call an oral tradition, which means that the people who composed these texts did not do so in writing, but rather they composed these, they memorized these texts, they would recite them from memory, and they would pass them on from teacher to student through an oral tradition. And when it comes to dating the Rig Veda, so the question of how do we know when these texts were composed? Basically, what we do is internal comparison, relative chronology. The Rig Veda is a text. We have many, many other texts in Vedic and then also in Sanskrit. And what we do is we look at the language. Is the language more innovative in one text than in another? Then we assume that other text is older. If one text refers to another, then we assume that that other text is older than the text that refers to it. When we have ideas, philosophies, stories, ideas about the gods, where you have in one text a much further developed image, a much further developed theory than in another text, you assume that that other text, again, is older. And so through detailed comparison among all of these texts, both their language and their ideas, we arrive at an internal chronology, a relative chronology of the ages of these texts, and saying that the Rig Veda was composed between around 3,500 to 3,000 years ago. That is sort of our best educated guess. It's only a guess, but it is a guess that is based on a lot of evidence. Now, Vedic chanting, so as I say, these hymns were performed during Vedic rites, Vedic rituals. So these texts were not meant to be, read in your room, but they were performed, they were chanted. Vedic chanted was recognized by UNESCO as, I think it's called intangible or immaterial or intellectual world heritage. And so I'm not going to make you suffer through my paltry attempts at Vedic chanting. If you're interested in Vedic chanting, Google it. You'll find lots of very good performances. Instead, what I'm going to do now is just show you two excerpts from two hymns, just to give you an idea of what these hymns are like. And I'm just going to focus on their contents. So this here is the very beginning of the very first hymn of the Rig Veda. It's not the oldest, it's just the one that's customarily listed first. And like many other hymns, it is a hymn to a god. And it is a hymn that invokes a god. And the way these hymns work is psychologically really, really clever. It's a little bit like when you'd say to a friend, oh gosh, you're so good with computers. Can't you help me figure out this or that, you know, how to work with Excel or something. People address these gods and remind them, you have been so generous, so helpful, so supportive to these people, these groups in the past. Please now do the same thing for me as I invoke you and list your great qualities. And this very first hymn invokes Agni. Agni literally means fire, and the sacrificial fire is a central element of the Vedic rite. Agni, therefore, is the kind of deified fire, the personified fire. So it says, Agni do I invoke, the one placed to the fore, god and priest of the sacrifice, the Hotar, which is a specific kind of priest, most richly conferring treasure. Agni to be invoked by ancient sages and by the present ones. He will carry the gods here to this place. By Agni, one will obtain wealth and prosperity every day, glorious and richest in heroes. So we have these many qualities of Agni that are listed. And Agni here is a mixture of a god and actually sort of, you know, the literal fire, because when it says, you know, he will carry the gods here to this place, what is meant is that there is this idea that if we pour the sacrifice into the sacrificial fire, it will burn. And the smoke basically is the way that the burning, the sacrifice is the way in which the gods can consume the sacrifice, can be nourished by us through our sacrificial actions. And so if we have the sacrificial fire into which we pour the sacrifice, the gods will come to us because they will accept our offering of basically nourishment. So this kind of hymn is fairly typical of many other Vedic hymns. So we find descriptions, invocations of gods, but there are also many other kinds of hymn in the Rig Veda. We find poetry, we find beautiful descriptions of nature, partly deified, partly not. We find conversations between partly divine beings. I think there's also one hymn that is that's a conversation between human beings. We find very everyday things. There's one that's basically a lament by someone who is addicted to gambling. How's that for a very current, a very timeless topic? And there's also very philosophical texts in there. And that's the second hymn that I wanted to briefly introduce you to, which is from the 10th, from the last book of the Rig Veda. And I hope you can see in the top right-hand corner here, this is 10.129, and these are the translators whose translations I'm using. So this hymn starts out by saying, the non-existent did not exist, nor did the existent exist at that time. At that time is referring to the beginning of everything. So what we've got here is a series of thoughts on the question of how did the world come to be? Somehow we exist, and somehow the world of whatever kind seems to exist. How can that be? Was it always, or did it come to be? Did something come to be from nothing? Both of these things are equally difficult to imagine for most of us, or I would maybe say even for all of us. And this hymn doesn't give us answers to these questions, but it just restates, or it states the paradox that we're dealing with in such a beautiful and poetic way. The non-existent did not exist, nor did the existent exist at that time in the beginning. There existed neither the airy space nor heaven beyond. The world was often imagined as having sort of three parts: the ground, the airy space, and the heavens, and none of these three bits existed. So for anyone for whom the first bit is too abstract, we're here being given examples of the things that didn't exist, namely the various bits of the world. So what moved? What movement was there? You know, movement is a way in which we can see the existence of life, the passing of time, and so on. What moved back and forth? From where and in whose protection? Did water exist, deep depth? So water, something you have lots of, fairly simple substance, many reasons for why you might want to list that specifically. Death did not exist, nor deathlessness then. Another kind of paradox. There existed no sign of night or day. That one, Tad Ekam, breathed without wind, another paradox, by its independent will. There existed nothing else beyond that. So we're told, there was something, that one, but we don't really know what exactly it is. The hymn doesn't say, because, well, we don't know. I'm not going to go through the entire hymn. I'll just continue to the end. If my computer lets me. Here we go. Who really knows? Who shall here proclaim it? From where was it born? From where did this creation come? The gods, and now this is really radical, the gods are on this side of the creation of the world. So then who does know from where it came to be? So it's here saying that, we don't know how the world was created because we exist much later than the creation of the world. But actually the gods, when they were created into an already existing world. So they, just like us, are on this side of creation. So they also don't know. This creation, from where it came to be, if it was produced or not, he who is the overseer of this world in the furthest heaven, he surely knows. Or if he does not know. I love this hymn because it gives us these questions in such beautiful ways, maybe suggesting, maybe hinting at answers, but not prescribing any answers. Because I think we can't really know. We can believe, but we can't really know. And this is what this hymn acknowledges in a very, I would argue, elegant way. Now, let me see where we are. Oh yeah, now next up comes Panini. But before we get to Panini, as I said, Vedic is the language not just of the Rig Veda and of other texts that we call together the Vedas, but also of literature that then comments on these texts. So you can see here we've got these hymns that are partly mysterious, partly unclear, that all have these very interesting ideas in them. And what we find are several levels of interpretation, of development of thought that are basically based on these four Vedas. We have the Brahmanas, which give many, for example, give many background stories of and explanations of things that are mentioned in the Vedas. Then we have the Aranyakas, we have the Upanishads, and all of these go from more specific to less specific to more theoretical, more general. The Upanishads, for example, they try to develop systematic philosophical thought that is ultimately based on, rooted in the ideas that we get in the Vedas. And this then takes us to Panini. Why is this one man so important in the history of Sanskrit? Well, the language that people for whom the Vedas were important changed, because that's what spoken language does. But the Vedas remained important, and so it remained important to keep their language intelligible. What do you need to do if you want to keep an old language, a language of old texts intelligible? You create a grammar, and a grammar is basically a list of language rules, a list of all the rules that you need to know if you want to be able to understand or maybe speak this language. And such a grammarian tradition arose. And the sort of culmination of this tradition is someone who we know by the name of Panini. We don't know, this is the name ascribed to him. We don't know who he was, whether he was one person or maybe the head of a group. We don't know when exactly he lived, presumably between 2,600 to 2,400 years ago-ish, probably somewhere in the northwest of the subcontinent, possibly outside of the boundaries of what is current modern-day India. What was so special about him? Well, he composed a grammar that was considered so much better than that of any of his predecessors that people stopped using the grammars of his predecessors and started using only his. So the only reason that we know that there were grammarians before him is because he mentions them, and because we assume that it would be really, really tricky to create a grammar like he did from nothing. So what did he do? He created a language, or he perfected a language that was a technical language that was highly, highly, highly specialized. He composed his grammar in what we call sutras. Sutra literally is a thread. And that's just the technical term for, or the word for a mnemonic. And these sutras were meant to be memorized. And so that you can memorize them, they're kept as short, as concise as possible. They are just under 4,000 rules, and they can fit onto around sort of 25 regular pages, A4 or letter size, depending on where you are. I actually tried this out before this talk. I downloaded the entire text off the internet and then formatted it in such a way that it basically is just like a regular book or a magazine article or something like that. And it covers around 25 pages. So very, very concise when you compare that with other grammars that you may have in your possession of other languages. Minimal. And so that these sutras can be so precise, the language that they are composed in has to be highly specialized, highly technical. And so in themselves, these sutras are unintelligible for non-specialists. If you just know Sanskrit, you won't be able to, on the basis of that, understand Panini's language. To understand his language, to understand these sutras, you need to learn this technical language. What does the technical language involve? Well, several elements. First of all, you have words that are used not with a general meaning, but with a very strictly defined meaning. It's just like, you know, when in common language I say mouse, then I can mean all sorts of things. You know, there's all sorts of things. There's field mice and dormice and this and this and that. But when I use the word mouse in a technical sense, so for example, when I'm talking about computers, it's perfectly clear that I'm using it only to refer to this little device that may look like a mouse that is used for me to access things on the screen. So I'm moving my mouse, and that's why you see me moving the cursor. And this is how all technical languages work. You use words with strictly defined meanings, and that's also what we find in Panini. But Panini goes further. It's not just that he defines or gives strictly defined meanings to words, but also to word forms, to grammatical qualities of words, such as case forms. Now, case is a system of marking what function a noun plays in a sentence. For example, we've got that in English. If I say I cut the cake with a knife, then I, by means of this little word with, say that the word knife is here used as an instrument. I cut the cake with a knife. But if I say there are still crumbs on the knife, then by giving you this little on, then I'm creating a different case form, which basically displays this thing, the knife, not as an instrument, but as a place where there's crumbs on the knife. Sanskrit cases work like that. In English and in Sanskrit, the different case forms have a variety of meanings, a spread of meanings. And in Panini, you find case forms used with very strictly defined meanings and functions. And I'll give you examples of that in just a moment. Then Panini also creates a number of new terms that are all monosyllabic. So just one syllable, because, you know, he's trying to be as precise, as short as possible, so that his rules can be memorized. And these new terms are not just monosyllabic, but they're also what I describe with the very scientific and very philological term, weird. What do I mean by weird? Well, languages all consist of sounds. All languages have sounds. All languages do not have all sounds. In English, I can use a sound combination such as mp at the end of words, lamp, ramp, temp, and so on. But I do not have English words that begin with mp. If I created a word that begins with mp, there would clearly be non-English. You know, if to a native speaker, that would immediately sort of raise a red flag, and you'd just go, okay, so this is not an originally English word. And Sanskrit is similar. The Sanskrit words can only end in a number of sounds, a number of consonants specifically. And so the terms that are created here, I've given you 3 examples, end in consonants that Sanskrit words usually don't end in. So hal, which is the term for all consonants, ends in an L, which is very unusual. Sup ends in a P, which is also very unusual. That's the term for noun endings. Lut, words of this shape are basically clearly odd in the system of Sanskrit. So here, another clearly visible technical term, lut stands for the future tense. So we create these new terms. But so that you don't have, you know, a random creation of new terms, we have this brilliant system, and it's really, it's a work of genius that we know as the Shiva Sutrani, Maheshwarani Sutrani, Shivani Sutrani. There's a number of words, a number of names for this. And the Shiva Sutrani, Sutrani is just the plural of sutra, is an arrangement of all Sanskrit sounds in a way that allows us to create these one-syllable expressions to refer to all sounds of a specific kind. For example, simple vowels, glides, consonants, voiceless consonants, and so on. And this, which may seem sort of very, very esoteric and very, very specialized, actually is really, really important throughout the Sanskrit language. So I'll show you these Shiva Sutrani here. This is them, all 14. And what you see we've got these lowercase letters, and then we've got these uppercase letters. The uppercase letters are not to be seen as sounds, but they're sort of markers in the system. And if I want to create one of these new terms, what I do is I start with whatever sound I want to describe, and then I go to the nearest marker letter. So for example, when I create a term ik, going from I to k, then I have a one-syllable term that refers to the sounds I, U, R, L. Not to N, because that's just a marker term. That's a marker, that's not an actual sound. I, U, R, L. Gives me ik. Ait goes from I to ch, so that includes the sounds I and ow. Those of you who've already done some Sanskrit may go, hang on, that's the vriti vowels. Or if I look at ing, that has e, o, n. That's the term for both of the guna vowels, e and o. Or if I say nyam, then I have nya, ma, na, and na, which is all my nasals. And I can do that within one line, or I can also go, you know, across lines. And I'll give you one example that applies these terms. This is in the 6th chapter of the Ashtadhyayi, which is what we call Paanini's grammar. Basically just means something that has 8 chapters, so does what it says on the tin. And in the 6th chapter of that, we have this rule, iko yan achi. Without sandhi, that would be ikach yan achi. And sandhi is something that I'm not going to go into much detail here. It's basically a system of how the pronunciation of words changes when they are put together in a sentence. And so when we have this ikach yan achi, we have here the 6th case or genitive form of ik. That's a case form. We have the 1st case or nominative form of yan. And we have the 7th case or locative form of ach. And as I said, the cases have specific meanings, very clearly defined meanings in Panini. This here, the genitive basically says, of something that we start out with, we get what stands in the nominative. So if you have some transformation, the thing in the genitive is the starting point, the nominative is what you get. And then the locative is basically the thing before which, in front of which, you get this transformation, you get this change. So of ik, we get yan before ach, which means of the vowels I, U, R, and L, which are ik, we get, or these are replaced by y, w, r, l, which is yan. when they stand before any vowel, and any vowel is at. This again may seem very specific, but it's something that you find all throughout Sanskrit. So for example, if you have a word such as mati, which means mind, in the first case or nominative, it has the form mati. So the ending here is just this little aspiration, this h, this so-called visaga. And in the sixth case or genitive, we have the ending ach. And in front of this ach, which begins with a vowel, this I changes into a y. So this I, which is an element of ik, just go back. So I is an element of ik, is replaced by a y, which is an element of yan. An element of yan. And so we do not get mati ach, but we get matyach. And this is something that we find in countless words, but I haven't counted them. It's just very many. And so through these little, I, ko, yan, achi. So in 5 syllables, we have defined this rule, which is fundamental to how Sanskrit word formation works. And Panini had around 4,000 of these rules with which he defined the Sanskrit language, or with which he defined the language of these Vedic texts. And Panini probably intended his work mainly to describe how the language had been used, but from around a century after he lived, his work was seen as prescribing how the language was to be used in the future. So not a description of what had come before, but if you want to continue using this language, you take all the rules where he says, this is optional, but this is how you do it. They were taken and they were seen as a prescription of how the language was to be used from that point on. And that has the result that for the past around 2,300 years, Sanskrit has been used, has been written following Panini's rules, and has thus been frozen in time. So if you know the rules of, if you look at any Sanskrit text that's 2,000 years old, same grammar as a text that's 1,500 years old, 1,000 years old. And this form of Sanskrit is what we call either Sanskrit or classical Sanskrit. Sanskrit to contrast it with Vedic, classical Sanskrit to contrast it with epic Sanskrit, which is the language of the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. These are texts that are also the result of a long oral tradition that began long before Panini, and that sort of came to a culmination several centuries after Panini. We're not sure exactly when, but basically epic Sanskrit means mostly classical Sanskrit, mostly post-Paninian, but with some elements that are not sanctioned by Panini, and these exist because basically they and the texts originated at a time when these specific rules as outlined by Panini weren't followed yet, when they weren't seen as obligatory, when there was no prescription on how to write Sanskrit or how to compose Sanskrit yet. So Vedic, epic Sanskrit, kind of on the cusp, classical Sanskrit. And so classical Sanskrit has been used for an enormous number of texts in a huge variety of genres all over the Indian subcontinent for the past 2,300 years. We have texts in poetry of all kinds, drama, narrative, including fables, religious texts from a variety of traditions, including Shaiva, Vaishnava, Buddhist, Jaina, technical literature on many topics, including grammar, medicine or biology, law, custom, morals, astronomy and astrology, alchemy, mathematics, architecture, philosophy, and in just this little word philosophy, if you're interested in, for example, yoga is one of the 6 sort of usually called orthodox schools of Indian philosophy. So all yogic texts would be sort of a fraction of this bit here, of this point. And so it's really an embarrassment of riches. There's really something for everyone there. And there's such a wealth of texts that many actually are hardly known and waiting in archives still to be discovered. And so there's this wonderful work to be done by current and future scholars, I hope. I've just given you this run through Sanskrit literature. And as I say, there's a lot. And I just want to give you a little taste of it to not make this completely abstract. But what I can really only give you a very few, very brief examples. And the examples I've chosen, I chose because they resonate with me personally. If you were giving this talk, you might have chosen completely different texts and they would have been at least as important, at least as valid. So as I say, there's just a lot. And I hope that the examples that I'm giving you will resonate with just a few of you maybe. So I'm starting with two poems by the poet Bhartrhari. He lived around 500 years ago, sorry, 1500 years ago, we think, 1500, so around 5th century AD. And in this case, I will actually force you through a little bit of me chanting, because with this kind of chanting, I know at least a little bit how to do it. Nindantu niti nipunaya rivastuvantu, Lakshmi samavishatu gacchatu vayateshtam, Adyaiva vamaranamastu yugantareva, Nyayapatah pravichalanti padanadhira. Which translates as, let those conversant with proper behavior blame or praise. Let money come or go as it pleases. Let death arrive now or in another age. From the right path, the steadfast wise do not diverge one step. What I'm translating as the steadfast wise, that's here this word dhira, which basically means both of these things. And I couldn't find a good one-word translation of it into English, so I'm translating it with two words here. And what we've got is something that I would say is not just modern, but timeless, a desire for us to basically be sort of settled, calm, maybe happy with what we have. As long as we do that, as long as we know we're doing the right thing, let others blame or praise. As long as we know that, we can be perfectly happy and perfectly healthy, even if we're not rich. So even if we lose some money, that may not be a big deal. Death is something that I would say all of us maybe don't worry about, but because it's something that none of us know anything about, have any experience really with firsthand, it's something that we sort of think about. But whether we think about it or not, it doesn't really matter. So if we can, we just have to let it go and be faced with the fact that, yeah, we're all going to die at some point. So this kind of English, difficult language, this kind of serene state of mind is something that many of us would, I say, aim for. And maybe some of you have reached this. So here we get this beautiful description of a state of mind that it would be great to have. But then we also get poems like this from Bhartrhari. What am I saying? Bhartrhari. He who has money, that man comes from a good family. He is a learned man, renowned, virtuous. He alone has a voice. He must be paid attention to. All qualities depend on money. And when you hear this, you sort of go, hang on, wait, what? No, that's nonsense. If you're rich, that doesn't mean that you're a good person, that you're virtuous or anything like that. I can give you tons of counterexamples to that theory. But don't we all sometimes act as though all of these things were true? If you have someone, who's quite wealthy, which probably means that they're also quite influential, quite powerful, it's kind of nice to have them on your side, make sure that they don't put any obstacles in your way. Maybe they'll even support you financially when you need it. And so to a person like that, many people wouldn't say, oh, you're horrible, but they would say, oh, such a nice young gentleman, and so intelligent, so clever, and all that family, such lovely people, and such all around wonderful, wonderful human beings. That's what we say about rich people, or at least many of us say about rich people. And that's kind of frustrating, but it's just a fact. And what I love about this poem is that, this is an experience that I have had that I find highly frustrating. And apparently here's this person from 1500 years ago who I know lived in a world quite different from mine, lived a life quite different from mine, but here's something that he and I share. And I just find that I feel this sort of this kinship. I find that poems like these just unite you across the times, across the miles and miles that split us up geographically. And that's something that world literature simply does. It connects you with people. It shows you that other people actually may have quite a bit in common with you or you with them. I sort of think that, you know, if Bhartrhari and I were to sit in the same faculty meeting, we would probably both roll our eyes at the same annoying people. As I say, very personal take on this, but that's just what I think when I read these poems and many more that Bhartrhari wrote. A completely different excerpt from Sanskrit literature, a bit from the Bhagavad-Gita, which is a text that is a conversation between two beings, basically about the question of how to live well, how to live rightly, how to live a good life. And so that you can know how to live a good life, you need to understand about the structure, you know, the reality of life, and including some fundamental teachings such as the cyclical nature of the world and the fact that basically we are born, we die, we are reborn, we die again. What is permanent is our souls, and what dies, what is born and dies is just the body with which our soul is then linked with in this physical existence. And that's something that is kind of difficult to grasp because none of us have any firsthand experience of, past lives, future lives, or something like that. It's just something that we know in the abstract. And here's a strategy that you find very often in Indian philosophy in order to introduce a concept that may be new or alien. You basically give an example of something that is old and well-known, very well familiar. So what we have here, just like a man having put down old clothes, puts on other new ones, so the soul, having put down old bodies, takes on other new ones. So unless you're very young, you will have had this experience of putting away old clothes because they're threadbare or because after Corona, we've all gained a bit of weight and they've become too tight. So you put off old clothes and you take on new ones. And what this verse is telling us is that this is exactly how we could imagine or understand what the soul is doing. So trying to introduce difficult new concepts by reference to familiar old ones. So that would be my very, very brief set of examples on classical literature. As I say, there is much, much, much more. This takes me to Sanskrit today. Now, as I say, I think that the best way to study Sanskrit is, systematically in the way that you would usually do at a college or university. Unfortunately, there's waning possibilities for that because universities increasingly are evaluated on commercial criteria, and Sanskrit doesn't lead you to a well-earning, doesn't give you a straight path to a well-earning profession. And so you will have far more people who study medicine or engineering or economics than Sanskrit. And so institutes or departments of Sanskrit are sort of slowly being eroded, being merged with other institutes or departments, being cut and so on. However, because Sanskrit and other similar subjects, other arts and humanities disciplines have so much to offer for us to understand ourselves as human beings, interest in them isn't waning. I would say rather it's the opposite. Interest is increasing. But the good news is that because there is this gap that's been created by what universities are doing, more and more institutions are arising that are basically offering what universities used to offer that are, not universities. So you do not need to be enrolled at a university. You do not need to pay exorbitant amounts of fees to be able to learn about Sanskrit, the language, Sanskrit literature, Sanskrit philosophical or spiritual traditions, and so on. If you're interested in learning Sanskrit or learning more about Sanskrit literature and so on, just basically Google around. There's many, many institutions that offer this, many places that offer this. I'm just going to offer a shameless plug for the one that I'm teaching for, which is called Yogic Studies, which you can find at yogicstudies.com. I know advertisement in an academic talk, horrible, but they're just a great place. So that's why I'm mentioning this here. One aspect of Sanskrit today. The other aspect of Sanskrit today is political. Sanskrit is used as part of a political vision, but also as a political tool. Now, in India, where you have several official languages, for example, one of them is Hindi, which is the native language of less than half of the population. You also have English, which, while being extremely useful, that's how I'm communicating with you, is the language of the former colonial oppressors, colonial overlords. But if everybody in India were to speak Sanskrit, then you'd have this language that once used to be a pan-Indian language of supra-regional communication, scholarship, and so on. And it wouldn't be the native language of anyone, except for a very small minority. There are people who teach their children to speak Sanskrit right from the very beginning. But for almost everyone, it would not be the native language. So everybody would have to learn it. No one would be at an advantage. And so in that way, having Sanskrit as a pan-Indian spoken language is a beautiful thing. But then there are those who use Sanskrit as a tool for basically defining Indianness and saying that if you are not in one of the various Indian cultures that are based on Sanskrit texts, Sanskritic traditions, then basically that makes you un-Indian. And it's simply a fact that, Islam, which is not based on Sanskrit texts, has been in India for a very, very long time. There are many Muslims in India, and to simply define them as un-Indian and therefore try and deprive them of their citizenship or even excuse violence against them, that I think is just a very bad and very dangerous road to go down. But to come back to more positive things, if we want Sanskrit today, if we want a modern spoken Sanskrit, then that language needs to be created and actually has been created, because what we have in classical Sanskrit is highly polished, artful literary language, rather than sort of the everyday kind of communication that you would want to just, sort of tell your children, pass the butter or something like that. And so to create a new language from an old one, there's a couple of methods that you use, and we find these in modern Sanskrit and modern Icelandic in the creation of modern Hebrew from biblical Hebrew. And basically the main techniques that you need are to identify one straightforward way of expressing whatever you need to express. For everything that you want to be able to say, you find one straightforward way of saying it. And you will also have to deal with many gaps in your vocabulary, because things exist now that didn't exist in antiquity. And so you'll have to create new words for these new things. I'll give you one example of each. Classical Sanskrit has many ways of referring to the past. You pick one and you make that the standard. And something that I've heard in many, sort of, whenever I've heard spoken modern Sanskrit, what I've seen used as the standard for referring to the past, in the active is the so-called tawant participle, and the passive, the so-called tat participle. So if I want to, in spoken Sanskrit, in modern Sanskrit, want to say I saw, I would say aham drishtavati. If I wanted to say I was seen, I would say aham drishta. If I was a man, it would be aham drishtavan and aham drishtach. And as I say, classical Sanskrit, many, many different ways of saying this. And you can still use these in modern Sanskrit, but you're sort of the neutral one that you should know is just, this one. And there's reasons for why this was chosen that I can go into in more detail after the talk, if you'd like. Then I say you need to fill the gaps in the vocabulary. And Sanskrit, classical Sanskrit, uses compound nouns a lot. What is a compound noun? A word like sword fight, which consists of two words that can exist on their own, fight by means of swords, that's been put together, sword fight, treehouse, toothpaste, that kind of word. And so if you need a word for a concept like television, which is a compound, and it's half Greek, the tele is Greek and the vision is Latin, go us. Television literally means far seeing. And so the modern Sanskrit word for that is dura darshanam, which literally means far seeing. And that is the word, modern Sanskrit word for TV. And that's actually also the word in a more modern pronunciation. Doordarshan is the word for a Sanskrit language TV station in India. So that was my run through Sanskrit from the beginnings to modernity. And I'm aware that I've already spoken for about an hour and you're probably getting a little tired, but I can console you. Why should I care about Sanskrit is not going to take very long. Now, Sanskrit is a dead language, as some call it, and Sanskrit is not going to make you rich. But there are many reasons for learning Sanskrit, nevertheless. Many people always want to get skills out of anything they learn, and Sanskrit will give you skills. So, learning a language on the most basic level is a complex process that requires patience, dedication, and hard work. And thus, when you learn a language, this process fosters these skills in you. Learning a language teaches you how to work with considerable amounts of information and to evaluate new information. You know, you've got all that new vocab, new ways of forming words, forming sentences, and then you constantly learn new knowledge that you have to kind of slot into the system as you already understand it. And learning, getting to grips with large amounts of information, evaluating new information are important skills, I would argue, anywhere in life. Then when you learn a language, always wonderful. When you learn an ancient language, actually that may be even better for our purposes here, because these are usually learned and taught in a slightly different way from spoken languages. Their grammar is often taught in a much more systematized way. And that helps you understand language structures more clearly, which in turn, I think, is useful for learning other languages, including modern languages too. I myself only really started to understand German grammar after I'd been introduced some grammar in Latin. That's how it worked for me. That was the utilitarian point of view. Still well valid, but utilitarian. Language also is what gives you access to a culture, and especially to the past of that culture's history. And a culture, which is customs, beliefs, inquiry, doubt, humor, fear, hope. All of these things are not only beautiful, life is always better when it has beauty in it, but they're also necessary in a way. All these things, inquiry, hope, fear, customs, humor, because all of us are faced with the fact that for some odd reason, we're all alive and thinking and feeling, and we are apparently surrounded by the world, whatever it may be. And people from all over the world have been trying to get to grips with that, the fact that we exist, that apparently the world exists, with the question of what am I doing here? How am I to live my life? What does it mean to be a good person, to live a good life, and so on. And Sanskrit literature, because there's just so much of it, offers all sorts of thoughts and suggestions on all of these questions. So it will help you with just being a better human. Sanskrit is a super regional language of literature and scholarship that was used over a very long period of time across an enormous area, which means that by learning one language, you get access to a variety of cultures, not just one, but a variety of cultures. And that is good in itself, again, I think, but again, I think it's also necessary and important, because if you get to know another culture, someone else's thoughts or viewpoints, and especially if you get to know their thoughts in their own language, the more you understand them, and the more difficult it will be for someone to tell you that these people, that culture is the other, and therefore supposedly lesser, less good than you, less good than your family and friends. So the better you know another culture, the more difficult it becomes to be a racist. It's still very much possible, but fortunately it becomes much more difficult. And also, I think it's really important to be able to access all these texts, these thoughts, all these things in the original, because translation is interpretation, and you don't want to read someone else's interpretation. If possible, you want to read the thing itself. And even if the thing itself is just poetry or literature, literary language is about a combination of form and content, about how you say what you say, about saying a funny thing in a beautiful way, a beautiful thing in a unusual way, a thought-provoking thing in a way that will nevertheless keep you from turning away from it, even though it is a thought that you may not like. So it's always about a combination of form and function, form and contents. And that combination is often lost in translation. And these are just the general reasons for everyone why they might want to learn a language such as Sanskrit. But especially if you follow any Sanskrit-based spiritual or philosophical translation, and certain texts and their meaning thus are really important, of crucial importance to you, it really helps you to be able to understand what these texts say, what they don't say, and where they are ambiguous and how they are ambiguous. Because, you know, if these texts have this great importance for you, then you have a much more mature, much more stable, much more sort of self-based approach towards them if you can read them, if you can understand them in their original, unfiltered by the views of others. And that's what I would like to say. So thank you so much for your attention and your patience. I have talked for over an hour. I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonia. I think every interaction I have with Antonia, no matter whether it's a formal class or an informal chat, is always filled with so much detail, so much rich information. This was definitely part of that pattern. But today we also got the additional little treat of hearing your singing and your chanting. I hope we get more of that. So you might have noticed that there's a question and answer button at the bottom, and some people have been posting their questions. So if you have any questions, we're happy to have Antonia address them. I will start with one of the first ones that usually comes up anytime there's a class or a discussion about Sanskrit, which is a neuroscientist had published a few years back his paper and had coined the term the Sanskrit Effect, which was his findings seeing the MRI brain scans of Vedic pundits who had, of course, memorized thousands and thousands of verses of Sanskrit, and noticed that certain regions of the brain that dealt with cognitive function seemed to be enlarged as compared to the average. So he termed this the Sanskrit Effect. Could you address that? That seems to come up quite a bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So as I mentioned, we have these really impressive oral traditions of texts, for example, for the Vedas, for memorizing the Rig Veda. And so we have people who over the course of their lifetime memorize this entire text, you know, which is huge. And that, of course, is quite the mental feat. And if you memorize, the more you memorize, the better you get at memorizing, and it does make a difference in your brain. However, and it's you know, if you term it the Sanskrit effect, that kind of makes sense, because, you know, this is these kinds of changes, these kinds of changes in your brain often come about through, for example, memorizing the Veda. And there are not many other parts of life nowadays where we memorize that much. But the exact same changes in MRIs have been found in people who memorize a lot, but other things. So for example, in London, cab drivers used to have to memorize what's known as the knowledge, which is basically, you know, before we had GPS, before we had sat-nav, you had to know how to get from any street in London to any other street in London by the most direct route. And so you had to memorize not just, where everything was, but exactly how to get from any point A to any point B. And that was also a huge feat of memorization. And studies done on the brains of people who had learned the knowledge basically showed those same effects. So the effect is created by memorization, not necessarily by memorization of particular contents, but because often the memorization of large, of considerable contents is done by memorizing Sanskrit texts. That's why it's sometimes called the Sanskrit effect, even though it's not the Sanskrit that is directly responsible for the brain changes.
So we have another question here. Is there another structured and recorded language from the same time period, like Sanskrit, on the Sino-Tibetan side?
So I must admit that I know shamefully little about Tibetan, but the thing with so the Sino bit of this with Chinese is that because Chinese is passed down, Chinese has been written for a very, very, very long time, but its writing system is what we call logographic. So you have kanji, you have basically one symbol that stands for a certain concept. So you have a certain sign, a certain character, and that stands for constellation, or for food, or something like that, for any idea, any concept that you want. Whereas Sanskrit is written in a way that pays very close attention to how words are pronounced. So with Chinese, we know going back very far, this is the written character used for this concept. With Sanskrit, we know not just, this is how it's written, but we also know to a fair extent of precision, this is how the word was pronounced. And if you're interested in literature, then what you need is just basically the concepts. You don't need to know how things were pronounced back then. You will still be able to read the texts. But for other kinds of linguistic research, so for example, for language comparison, what you would want is a language that actually writes down sounds and not ideas. And so, yes, Chinese is, well, we have Chinese, records of Chinese writing from much, much, much earlier than of Sanskrit. But again, when a text is first attested physically, doesn't necessarily mean the same as when that text came to be. With Chinese, we have the ideas, we have the text, we have the concepts, we do not have the pronunciation. So that's the difference, but Chinese basically has been attested for, several millennia.
So we have a question about the PIE, the Proto-Indo-European. One person is asking, how did we find out that Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek are sibling languages, and that one wasn't derived from the other?
Right, yeah. So as I say, new languages develop when basically a language community splits up, and language change then happens independently. So, the community that eventually ended up speaking Sanskrit had certain language changes. Mostly it's pronunciation changes that then lead to other changes. Whereas, for example, the group that ended up speaking Greek had a different set of changes. So one set of changes here, another set of changes there. And if you want to sort of check whether one of these languages then is the ancestor of another, basically what you would want in that one language is, you've got all the changes that happen in this one language would also be attested in the other language, but the other language then has more changes attested. And what we find in Sanskrit is a set of changes in vowels, where vowels that, for example, in Greek or in Western languages, there's three different ones. There's a, there's e, there's o. And in Sanskrit, all of these three vowels are a. So a, e, o, just a. But, and so you could say, well, you know, Sanskrit has a, and then in the other languages, that's just developed into a, e, and o. But in Sanskrit, we have proof that actually Sanskrit originally also, instead of just this one a, had the three different ones, a, e, o. Because in front of an e, we find certain changes in pronunciation that we do not find before a and o. So everywhere where Western languages have an e, Sanskrit doesn't have an e anymore, it's got an a, but in front of these us and only these, do we have those other changes in pronunciation. So that is an indication that this tripartite function a, e, o that we've got in Western languages at one point also existed in Sanskrit. And so if we want to say that Sanskrit is the origin language of you know, these other languages, basically what we need to reconstruct is that Sanskrit once had a, e, o, and then and so we have those changes from a, e, o to a, and then later on these other languages sort of split up from Sanskrit, and then these three vowels that have all become a, all of a sudden split back up into this original state. So we have an original state of three vowels that then becomes one. In Sanskrit remains one, and in these other languages splits up again, but in the exact same way that it had been hundreds of years earlier. And that's just quite unlikely. It's much more unlikely that we had an original language that had a, e, o, and then one branch split off and kept a, e, o, and Sanskrit split off and turned all of these into a. So you have basically just this one change that you need to reconstruct rather than three different ones. They all converge into what we see in Sanskrit. Sanskrit continues, and then these other languages recreate a state that we had exactly like that several centuries earlier. Because of that, because of these things, because of this kind of linguistic evidence, because it's a linguistic question, do we think that Greek, Latin, and so on, the European languages are not descended from Sanskrit, but they're all descended from a common ancestor?
We have a question about the sort of anatomical and physiological aspects of Sanskrit. If you could talk about how the alphabet relates to the different part of the throat and the mouth, and whether that's a unique characteristic. Do we see that in other languages? And also, how does Sanskrit affect breathing? There's a lot of, as you begin to learn Sanskrit, you do hear many teachers discuss how it does affect your breathing, the rhythm of your breathing, the depth of your breathing. So these anatomical and physiological aspects.
Yeah. I think we need to keep two things separate. One is the language and the other is the writing system. Because, you know, language is a natural thing. All humans develop language. All humans start speaking. You know, even if you do not teach your baby, this is red, this is green, the baby will pick that up. However, writing is something that is an acquired skill, a skill that needs to be taught. I know some children learn how to write and read, even if they're not formally taught, but for the large majority of us, you know, we need formal instruction. And what we have in Sanskrit is this really, really impressive grammatical tradition. You know, I was talking about Panini. There's much more to say about that. And these early grammarians had a really impressive understanding of how language worked. So, for example, what makes the sound p different from the sound b, or the sound b different from the sound b. And so what they did when they basically kind of adapted existing writing systems so that they would perfectly suit the needs of Sanskrit. They didn't do what Western languages did, which is sort of keep the order of letters in which it just happened to be. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G. The reason why it's in that order is not systematic, it's just historical. That's kind of what we took over from earlier people who used this kind of writing, who took it over from yet someone else. But no, those grammarians made the conscious choice to order these sounds and the letters that represent them in a way that is that follows linguistic principles. So you've got first the vowels, then the stops and the nasals. You've got the glides. You've got the sibilants. You've got the aspirate h. And so that was a conscious decision to arrange this alphabet, for the lack of a better word, in this way. I am not aware of other alphabets that do this, but that may simply be because, you know, I know the Roman alphabet, I know Greek, Hebrew. I used to know a little bit of Linear B, and then I know Devanagari. Yeah. So, and in the alphabets that I know, the order, this linguistic order, this systematic order, we find only with the Devanagari. And so that is a feature not of the language, but of the grammarian tradition, which, as I say, was, you know, truly impressive. When it comes to breathing, well, I must admit that I'm fairly clueless here. My instinct would simply be that when you do things consciously, yeah, so, you know, when I speak my language, I just sort of prattle on and don't really notice what I'm doing. But when I'm learning a new language and I'm told, you know, this is how you pronounce this is how you pronounce that, then I do things a lot more consciously, and breathing may very well be a part of that. It's not something that I personally have experienced, but then, as I say, you know, I learned Sanskrit with a book called Teach Yourself Sanskrit. I don't know whether if I'd had, you know, a more regular sort of teacher, whether they might have then mentioned these things, but it's not part of my personal experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything.
So we have a question here. Do we know how spoken Sanskrit has changed since the time of Panini, as opposed to written Sanskrit, which froze in time after his writing down of the grammar?
Right. So there's two elements, I guess, to this question. You know, the pronunciation of Sanskrit, that has changed fairly little. It has changed a little bit. So, for example, you know, in the north, you'd say Sanskrit. In the south, you would probably more say Sanskrit or something like that. So, you know, there's small changes. What once was ow is pronounced as o by many. What's pronounced as p originally is pronounced as f by many. So there's small changes in that. And then we had spoken Sanskrit throughout the ages. So people didn't just write it, but they also spoke it. But it was, as far as I can tell, very much a, you know, something that would be for the learned few, who would be taught exactly how to speak Sanskrit. And so, as far as we can tell, the spoken Sanskrit would have probably followed exactly the same rules as the written Sanskrit, which are the rules of Panini. And but the problem always when it comes to speech in the past is, you know, the spoken word, as soon as you've spoken it, it's gone. And so we assume that spoken Sanskrit in those times would have probably followed the, you know, the same rules as the written Sanskrit, as Panini, for the simple reason that we don't have any evidence to the contrary. You know, no one ever talks about innovations in speaking or something like that. It was a fairly conservative system where, you know, these were the rules and this is what you followed when you were writing, and thus probably also when you were speaking. Maybe we can guess, or we can sort of infer from what we see in the West, where Latin had kind of the same function in medieval Europe as Sanskrit does in India. You know, Latin was the language of communication, or Latin was the language of the church, we can tell that from different variants of Latin, different languages arose. And we can tell from the spelling of certain texts that probably someone who wrote Latin in France probably would have pronounced it differently from someone who wrote Latin in Germany. But as far as I know, we don't have such evidence when it comes to Sanskrit. And so basically, this is my very long way of saying, this is why I think we don't know that there would have been any difference in the spoken variant of the language from the written variant.
So we have a question about the state of Sanskrit scholarship and research in the world today. A multi-part question. One of the questions is, what is the state of scholarship? Are there any big mysteries or big questions that scholars of Sanskrit are trying to answer? When is the last time that one of these manuscripts was unearthed? And are any of your former students involved in the translation or analysis of any of these transcripts?
Right. Another shameless plug from me, the question of, what are the great things that yet need to be done? I just started this thing called the Sanskrit Studies podcast, where that is exactly the question that I ask everyone I interview. So from your perspective, in your area of Sanskrit studies, which is huge, what is the big thing that you wish people would look at, or that you wish you have time to look at? And so because unfortunately this field, fortunately the field is enormous, I unfortunately cannot give you a good answer that sort of is an all-around answer to your question. I can only say, go and listen to the podcast. It's a Sanskrit Studies podcast, and hear what everybody has to say individually. But for example, one thing that who comes to Sanskrit as a linguist, have always been fascinated by is the question of the Indus civilization script. So we have in the northwest of the subcontinent, we've got the Indus, sorry, not the Indus civilization, Indus Valley civilization. And if you've ever, flown that route. So when I went to Delhi, and I had flew back, I had a window seat, and I saw this arid landscape, and all of a sudden there was this lush band of green. That's the Indus, and this lush band of green existed, a long time ago, and so that was a very hospitable area in which to live, and people have lived there for a very long period of time. And the question is, these people spoke a language. What was that language? Was it a predecessor of Sanskrit? Was it an area that something that was spoken in that area before the Sanskrit, the Indic languages came there? We have a script which seems to be logographic, but it also hasn't really been, so like Chinese, characters seem to represent ideas rather than sounds. And that script, people try to decipher it, but as far as I know, we haven't really been successful with that yet. But that's something that's, an extremely interesting set of questions. And so not the podcast episode that comes out next week, but the episode that comes out on the 1st of October it's an interview with Michael Witzel, and he talks exactly about sort of that set of questions. So that might be something to look forward to. Well, it is something to look forward to, because he's a really fascinating person with great scholarship. Then the other questions of, when have we last had manuscripts discovered? Actually, we discover manuscripts, I don't want to say all of the time, but it is something that is ongoing. Because of the nature of scholarship, you don't necessarily always find out immediately that something has been discovered, because what people do is, they digitize the manuscripts, they try and assemble, information about it that they believe to be correct to the best of their knowledge, about its provenance, about its history. They often try to then, help you, they transliterate the texts. So there have been a number of discoveries over recent years. I couldn't tell you what the most recent one was. I wouldn't be surprised if it was yesterday or last week or something like that. And when it comes to students of mine, well, yes, I know that some of my students are involved in work like this, both when it comes to the digitization of texts that are already known, and I think also in work with manuscripts. And obviously that makes me, pleased as punch. But because my what I have been doing in in all of my jobs, so at Cornell, at Oxford, and now at the LMU, is I do the introductory Sanskrit classes. So I can't really say these are my students, because after they did basic Sanskrit with me, they then studied with many other professors who read far more intricate, far more difficult literature with them. So they learned from me as well. But if I say my students, that makes me sound grander than my contribution has been. But yes, I know that people who've learned Sanskrit from me have been involved in these things.
So you can probably tell from the way the shadows are moving. It's getting on in the evening out here in India. We do have lots and lots of questions still pending. Do you want to take a few more and then move it over to email or some sort of other forum?
Happily, absolutely, yes.
Okay. So we have a technical question. I think a lot of us who began studying Sanskrit have this question. I know I posed this question as well. Is it Sanskrit with an N, Sanskrit with an M, or Sanskritam?
Right. Depends, which is always the worst answer that a teacher can give. So hang on, let me see whether I can just quickly do this. Let me share my screen again. So this would be the Sanskrit way of spelling Sanskrit. So we here have a form Sanskrita, which is given an ending. I was earlier talking about cases and everything, and so the full form of this word would be Sanskritam. That refers to, that literally means something that has been put together, that has been composed, well composed, that is polished, that has been perfected. That is then the name for this language that we use in the sort of post-Vedic period. Now, the official way of transliterating this would be as this Sanskritam. Oh, no, sorry, that's wrong. It would be this Sanskritam. However, whenever you borrow a word into another language, and that may be, a language, a later version of Sanskrit. So, modern Northern Indian languages are derived from, are related to Sanskrit. Or if you borrow it into a language such as English, then you need to find a way of transliterating, of writing this old writing, and you need to find a way of pronouncing it. And so when you say Sanskritam, when you say so when you say Sanskritam, 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 the same thing, not with a nasalization, but with an N. All of these are valid ways of pronouncing the name of this language. This alternation between this kind of nasal, this sang, and this kind of nasal, sun, is something that you find in Sanskrit manuscript. It's in the Sanskrit manuscript itself. It's like, you may know the name Sanjay. Sanjay originally is Sanjaya, and some people pronounce it Sanjay, others pronounce it Sanjay, but this change from n to from to n, that's something that's kind of a freedom that you have within the Sanskrit tradition. Then the reason for sometimes saying Sanskritam or Sanskrita or saying Sanskrit The reason behind that is the following. So Sanskritam would be the full word, or if you use it as an adjective, so Vak means language, and then Sanskrita Vak would be the Sanskrit language, the Sanskritic language. This would be the full word, Sanskritam or Sanskrita. And this, as I say, is an ending, which is often dropped in modern pronunciation. And also an a at the end of a Sanskrit word is often dropped in modern pronunciation. So for example, in Sanskrit, you would say Rama, Yoga, Ganesha, whereas you'd say Ram, Ganesh, Yog, and so on. And so Sanskrita would be the Sanskrit way, and Sanskrit would be basically the more modern way of pronouncing it. And there, so I'm saying here that you've got these various possibilities. None is, you do not have one that is right with the others all being wrong. I say Sanskrit when I speak English or when I speak German. When I read out a Sanskrit text and the word appears, then I say Sanskrita.
So Antonia, while we've got the sort of word whiteboard ready to go, could you go into a little bit about the connection between Draco Malfoy and Sanskrit? I think when that came up in class, you could just see how excited people got to realize that while in some circles, Sanskrit has this label of dead language, in other ways, especially through that example, you just see how incredibly alive it is, not just in the context of Indian culture and Indian things, but all throughout, you know, as a global thing.
When you say Draco Malfoy, do you mean just generally my Harry Potter analogy, or?
We had gone into the etymology of the word Draco.
Oh, right. I remember. Yes. Yes. So, I mean, Draco is named after the Latin word for dragon. And oh gosh. So let's go into a little bit of etymology. Basically, let me just quickly get rid of those squiggly lines. Apologies. So, as I say, Sanskrit is related to European languages. And in Sanskrit, the verbal root for to see is drish, or in Devanagari, it would be drish. And this drish, in Sanskrit, when you have an original k sound, the k becomes a sh. And this is what we would probably have had originally, drick. And you then find vowels inserted either before the R or after the R. And so one form of this root of Sanskrit drish to see is what we would then find in Drakon, or we would find spelled with a C. And so, which is basically a dragon. And a dragon is literally the animal that sees. And I think this is to do with this idea of what, going back to Harry Potter, there you have a specific kind of dragon, you have a basilisk. And the basilisk basically will just freeze you, will just immobilize you if it looks at you, or if you look at it, then you will become emotionless. And as far as I know, the Draco, the dragon, is also the animal that whose gaze, whose ability to see, whose organs of seeing, of sight, give it these special abilities. And so, yeah, you get lots and lots of words like this, where you've got the Sanskrit root, and this root is reflected also in other languages, you know, in Latin, in Greek, in Germanic languages, in Celtic languages, in Slavic, in Baltic, and it takes different forms. And if you know about these language relationships, then very often learning new languages becomes easier, because you don't need to learn all the vocab over and over again. And also it kind of helps you understand the actual meaning of certain words when you know what they mean literally. That would be my take on that, which is, I hope, Shana, that's what you were thinking of.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the really unique kind of perspectives that we get learning Sanskrit from you and being in your class. And those types of things basically came up in almost every lecture that we had. Even though we were going chapter by chapter through the book, there were all of these outside things that were just pulled in that just really brought the entire thing to life, and just made it that much more fun, because obviously it's a thing where you have to do a lot of memorization. There's a lot of work, but there's so much fun as well. If etymology is your thing, then yeah, it's quite fun. So actually along these lines, and maybe we'll do about 2 more questions if that's
absolutely.
So I apologize for all of the other open questions, but again, we will provide Antonia's contact at the end, and you're more than welcome to get in touch. So one of the questions is, how long did it take you to teach yourself Sanskrit to a degree at which you felt that you could reliably translate a Sanskrit text?
I'm still in the process of that, because Sanskrit texts come in many different varieties of difficulty. So, for example, I mentioned the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and there I would say I can read these with a certain amount of fluency. And I'm sure that there's bits that I get wrong, or where I have to look up, how does this work? What exactly does this word mean in this context? But if it's about sort of reading, not for tiny detail knowledge, but for general understanding, I think I'm there. When it comes to reading, the works of Panini, or reading something like the Yoga Sutras, or also the Yoga Bhashya, there's so much thought that went into these, so much theory, so much a philosophical, by way of philosophical approaches, that when I read these in class with my students, we often spend 90 minutes on like 3 lines of text, because we want to sort of tease out everything that can be teased out from a text. These texts can have a variety of meanings. They can be used with various sort of different intents, with, small details can mean one thing, can mean another thing. And so with many texts, I would say I'm not there, and it will take me a while longer. I don't know whether I'll ever get there. I don't think I'll be able to read a Sanskrit text with the same fluency as I would an English or a German text. But it's slowly, with more and more genres, when I read them, that I am able to follow along just by reading without having to look up too much. Let's put it that way. But still very much part of the process. And that's also the thing, when you say, I want to learn a language, it makes it sound as though that there is such a thing. You start learning a language, you learn a language, and then you have learned a language. No, you will always be able to improve on what you're doing, to learn more words, more meanings of words that you already know, more usages, more phrasings. You will get more, a better feel for the style of a certain author or a genre. And I am still very much in that process.
So there are a lot of questions going back to the PIE. I think learning Sanskrit from you, either in the class or hearing lectures like this, is oftentimes the very first time that many of us have heard that there is such a thing as PIE, the Proto-Indo-European language, from which we believe all of these things have branched off. So I think it'll be great if we can maybe do another lecture on PIE and all the details and the evidence that we have of that. Then we also have a lot of questions about Panini and requests for you to teach a mini course on specifically those 25 to 30 pages of Panini's grammar. But I think the last question that we'll maybe have for this evening is about the future, the children. So given that you have had experience teaching children Sanskrit, what are some tips, tricks, advice that you might have on teaching Sanskrit to kids, the best age to start, the best resources, the best manner in which to start? Should it be all oral to begin with? Should it be a combination?
The best age to start, there isn't really one such thing. You know, you can start them very young. It really depends on you as the teacher. You know, some start at the age of 5. I know people who've started, you know, who are good Sanskrit speakers, who started with their own children, basically right from the crib, right from the very start. But, you know, Sanskrit classroom teaching. So what I saw at the school where I used to teach, St. James, they had the junior school, which started at the age of 5, just very gently. Children love memorization. And so learning how to write the Devanagari, you know, very clearly, very beautifully, that is something that they often enjoy. And when you, and that often also has a positive effect on penmanship. You know, basically, if you give them the chance to take their time to, you know, very carefully sketch out all these letters, and then to, of course, associate the sounds with the letters, and then to do, you know, very simple spoken things to accompany that, so that it just doesn't just remain this abstract thing, this abstract skill that isn't used for anything. But to start out with words that they can use often, and to start out with words that they may be able to link to other things. So, for example, when I taught, you know, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, I always had great fun asking them to suggest ways of remembering words. And so, for example, jalam, which means water, one of them then said, oh, gel. Yeah, gel in English. And actually gel and jalam, as far as I know, they are related. And so, you know, that's how they remembered jalam. Then turnam or turna is the word for grass. And I was teaching just at, you know, west of London, and there's a underground station called Turnham Green. And so, you know, they go Turnham, that's just like Turnham Green. And so they found their little ways of linking these words to things that they experienced, you know, from their own everyday lives. And so find ways to encourage them to basically tie in the Sanskrit things that they do with things that they do in other school subjects, or things that they are otherwise interested in. You know, there's a lot of modern Sanskrit culture that's arisen. You know, you find people who translate songs into classical songs into Sanskrit. So when I say classic, I mean like, you know, sort of rock songs or pop songs, you know, well-known songs that are a couple of decades old into Sanskrit. See whether you can listen to those, you know, especially with slightly older children, because that gives you the nice music component. So, you know, this is a very roundabout way, not very organized way of answering, but basically the core that I want to get to is make it relevant. Give them a reason for why they would want to know Sanskrit. And that's kind of what I try to do with this talk for adults. And then maybe that can be a sort of basis for thinking, for ideas for each of you individually who are interested maybe in teaching your child Sanskrit, or having someone teach your child Sanskrit, just to not just look at Sanskrit itself, but also the question of, you know, why do we want to learn this language? certain texts that they may then be able to read in the original, certain texts that they may have heard and that they may then be able to understand. So you've got a number of prayers that, you know, I know from my students of Indian origin that, you know, are still common in India nowadays that are Sanskrit, and, you know, gives them an ability to understand these things. So tie it in, make it relevant, give them a goal, and show them how they're slowly approaching that goal.
So we have a lot of people writing in to express their thanks. And so on behalf of everyone who was able to attend today, and hopefully the many, many more that will hear the recorded version of this once that goes live, I just want to express my own gratitude. Thank you so much to yourself, to you, and to all of the teachers that are really putting their time and their energy into helping the rest of us come along this journey and this path. So thank you so much again, Antonia.
Thank you. It's been my great pleasure. I still can't believe that I'm living a life where people actually come to hear me talk about Sanskrit, because, you know, I will talk Sanskrit at anyone who will let me. And so it's a great pleasure when I can do this in front of an interested audience. So thank you all very much for your questions. And so I would be delighted, Shana, to you know, give a talk about the European side of things. And yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Yeah, we will put up the contact information, both for if you're interested in signing up for a Sanskrit class with Antonia, and her email address. Just get in touch. I can tell you from personal experience, she answers every question, you know, so.
And from personal experience, you can tell it often takes a while.
Sometimes, yeah. But she does get there. And I've got to say, she is definitely one of the most patient teachers, no matter how minuscule or unimportant, or maybe answered a million times before you think your question is. She puts her heart and soul into every answer. So we'll put that slide up right now. Thank you all for attending today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.